now to a final session to move to kind of look out into the future a bit. What I've been talking about for this last 45 minutes or an hour with Matthew is sort of the concrete work for now. But I also want to cast out a little bit and say, what might churches look like on into the future? Where might we be headed for our congregation? To do that, though, I want to go back to a slide that's in your packet. One of the reasons I don't like PowerPoint is that the order in which it gets put is not the order in which it comes out of me. So, but back in your packet, you'll find this church models grid. And I just want to briefly touch base on this because it plays itself out as we think about where we're headed. We're living in a time and space where all three of these models are in play in North America. There are some churches that are living deeply in a very traditional model that sort of reflects the old Christendom model. The old model was that the church sort of exists as a place of chaplaincy for Christendom. People just simply go to church to worship and to gather and to provide comfort and care. Another model has emerged that is identified here as contemporary, whereas there's a sense of outward focus that we need to reach others for Jesus, but the tendency is to think about it in terms of goods and services. We're going to offer some things to you in order to get you to come so that we can bring you to faith. And that model is present in our churches. And I'm trying to say those as neutrally as I can. I'm not trying to make a judgment here, but that model is in play. Another model is emerging and has emerged for the last 20 years and will continue to surface that might be constrained as paying attention to God's purpose in the world and how we participate in it, that lends itself a little more to the kinds of things that we've been particularly saying today, that the church embodies a mission that's been sent, and we're playing out very consciously how we partner with the work of God in the world. And all three of these models are present in churches today. In fact, all three models are often present within a single congregation today, and often what creates a lot of difficulty in church leaders having conversation about what's next for today. So I just share that as a kind of a tool to reflect on or reference. Now I want to move on down in the slide deck. I may be able to do this, maybe not, we'll see, to this final section where I want to talk about where are we headed. What's next? And to say that as we move into the future, I think there are several frames by which you might envision where your congregation might be headed as we move into the future. One of those frames is the idea of extending what we are currently doing, which is to provide ministries, goods, services in a way that invite people to come and participate with what we are doing in our church. Now, that's not working. That's working well in some churches in North America today, particularly in the Bible Belt. That is, places like Texas. But it's working less well in more and more churches. Okay? But I want to acknowledge that is a way of doing church, and there are churches that are doing this and doing it very well. Okay? So I just want to acknowledge that. And if you're doing it and it's working, doing well, and then do it. But that's probably not the way that most of you are thinking about the future. A second way of thinking about this is what I'm going to describe as revival, or a revive mode. And that's where I think many of you will find yourselves. That is to say, we're going to seek God's renewal by joining in God's work and practice this traditioned innovation. We're going to reflect on the things that we're working on here, and we're going to seek revival and renewal. And that may it'll look in a lot of different ways. It may mean anchoring oneself to a particular geographic space. It may be anchoring itself to a particular frame or frames of ministry that you do in a city. It can take a lot of different shapes, but it's characterized by a renewal or revitalization of a congregation. Now, I want to say that sounds really good and really exciting, but I also want to say that common experience says that 2 out of 10 churches that say that's what they're going to do will have some effectiveness with it. I want to be hopeful but sober here, right? This is not as easy as it sounds, mostly because it means we have to let go and let God lead us. And we're not all that good about that as American people. That's kind of the core bottom line of this. The third mode might be described as reform. And by that I mean re-form. That is, we're going to reform our congregation through a merger or some sort of kind of restart, perhaps with another congregation. And we're going to seek God's preferred future together in a new framework. This idea of merger has been around for a long time, but some church experts say there'll be perhaps up to 100,000 of these over the next 10 years across American Christianity. Churches, small churches, banding together and finding a way of re-envisioning their future. Another way of thinking about this, which I think is very, very significant, and it bears much more time than I'm giving with this one little bullet point, is to plant. To plant a new church, a daughter church. To plant a church in a local neighborhood. To give rise and empower an intentional community that might live and work together. To frame out and work and minister and engage in what I described earlier as a third space. I've had experience with planting apartment churches in Atlanta. Communities of people meeting in large apartment complexes where more and more people live in North America if you're connected to an urban kind of context. To plant and let a new church with some old DNA, but with the freedom to allow new DNA to come into play, will in fact have a greater vitality and ability to adapt to the changing culture. Established churches simply have more and more barnacles on it that make it a little harder to make the turn. It's pretty hard to scrape the barnacles off the hull. We talked about life cycle of churches yesterday. That came up. The average life cycle of a church is about 50 years, unless there's been a significant sort of revitalization that occurs. And if you're in a church that's over 50 years old, it's going to be pretty challenging to see revitalization take place within. But there may be wisdom and insight within that church to say, let's plant another church and let another church take off with another 50-year scope of life in front of it. And we can take our wisdom, our knowledge, our finances, our resources, our assets, and help fuel something new. And this, and many manifestations of planning, is a significant feature of American Christianity in the next 10 years. It will be one of the major pieces of the landscape. And your church may be a part of that. One of the most exciting and compelling things that I can imagine happening in churches of Christ is a renewed vigor and imagination for planning new congregations of people. That will look different than Mama, right? It'll look different, and that'll be perfectly okay, because we know that life and culture shifts and changes, and we need to give birth to new expressions of the people of God. Replant. And the final one, and I have to just simply say it, is hospice. Hospice. Hospice, to move intentionally toward death. And it's okay. That's an okay thing too. To die with dignity is an important human value. And if a church chooses to do that with intentionality and purpose, as it thinks about, as we spoke last night, to relinquish resources for a new day and a new generation, then that may be part of what's in the future of some, will be a part of what's in the future of some of our churches. So I'm offering those as sort of trajectories of what's laying out there in front of us. And your church may find itself orienting itself to one or more of those sorts of frames as we move into the future. Now, I want to particularly focus on this notion of revival or revitalization, because it can spin off not only in revitalizing a church, but it may also give rise to plants and other things, and say that there are often some common blunders that take place in churches as they move toward this, as they try to do decision making. And I'm only going to mention one or two of these. I want to say, first of all, I'm going to put them all up here, and then I'm going to say just a word about one or two of these. This first one is important. You'll never get enough data to satisfy everybody in your church about what to do next. So give up on that, would you? Just data doesn't fix things. The realities that you're facing in your church will not be answered by just getting a little more data. It's going to happen when we listen well to our context, to our people, and we pray. The answers will emerge there. The situations we find ourselves in today are too complex for data to be able to respond to. The reality is that in complex systems, you cannot get enough data to answer things, because unexpected things happen when you begin to move forward, things that you cannot predict. That's why it's called a journey of faith. It's a journey of faith. And we move forward with wisdom and insight, yes, with data and other things, but don't think you're going to get it fixed that way. Another thing that I would simply say is that this is not a time for quick fixes. And so just firing the minister is not going to answer things. Or just building a new building will not answer things. Or just launching a new program will not answer things. Now, you may need to fire your minister. You may need to build a building. You may need to launch a program. But it better come out of deep, reflective work, not just to see if we can just do this little thing and see if that makes everything all right again. The world has changed. We're in a new time and a new place where a different kind of engagement will need to take place, which is what I want to say a word or two about now. This new world that we're moving into, Renee, you move it forward for me. Path forward begins with, and I cannot emphasize this enough, it must begin with a sense of mission. If you don't have mission, a sense of purpose, a telos, if you don't like the word mission, that's quite all right. Use the word of purpose. What is our purpose? Our purpose is bound up in God's action in the world. And we are duty bound by virtue of our baptism and call into the people of God to follow God and His work in the world. Case closed. There's no place for excuse about mission. If you mess around with that, if you get fuzzy with that, you've lost the very thing that you need to help keep you attentive to God's work in the world. We're going to need theological imagination. Theological imagination. You remember that arc that we talked about earlier, and asking the questions of what and why and what ought to be happening here and what are we going to do there? That's going to require for us to engage in prayer and imagination, of looking at Scripture, of looking at what's happening in our context, at looking at the world, and realizing, because theological imagination is infused with hope, because God is at work in all of this, that it gives us the courage to step forward into new kinds of things and try new things. Theological imagination. We're going to need to remember, and I can only just say a word about this, that leadership is secondary. That leadership is secondary. What we need in our churches are people who are first and foremost persons who own their baptism and are disciples of Jesus Christ. If we think that leadership is something we just sort of assume and we can make decisions and move forward, as leaders in our churches, these men and women that I'm looking at here, we've done ourselves a grave disservice. It begins first and foremost with our own ownership of us being sheep with a shepherd. And if we begin there, then we'll begin to recognize the kind of thing that we're on a path, a journey that we don't know the ends to, but we're going to be faithful in responding to the good shepherd, the shepherd of the sheep. We're going to recognize that there are times when we find ourselves with polarities, And there's times we find ourselves with problems. And I want to briefly talk about the difference. A polarity is when we find ourselves wrestling with stuff where it looks like there are two things that are in tension with each other, and we don't know quite what to do with that. And oftentimes churches get into a seesaw between two good things. Do we focus on discipleship or do we focus on outreach? And the answer is, hello, you're in a polarity. You attend to both because they need each other. If you're not engaging in discipleship, then you're not going to have wise, mature people to do outreach. And if you're doing outreach but have no place to bring people into places of formation, then you're not going to be able to continue to do what you do. They're both. And a polarity, when you find yourself moving into a space of a polarity, is not something that you come up with an answer that that brings about an end. It's something you continue to navigate and manage constantly, keeping it in balance. It's the kind of thing that parents do with kids, of giving them freedom but not too much freedom. And it's a constant management and negotiation that takes place. There are other times and places where we're faced with a problem or a dilemma or a crisis, of which we're spending a lot of time talking about today. A decline in our church. That's not polarity. That's a matter that requires not decision making, but discernment. And that kind of discernment will require us to take in several kinds of tasks. We'll move forward to adaptive leadership here. That we need to, first of all, pay attention to our context. If you're in a small rural church, then we need to think and act and practice and live with the realities of rural American life. And that will require great imagination and skill. And it doesn't do a lot of good to go to the big city and try to imagine what we can pull from the big city to do that kind of work. Are you in a refugee community? Are you in a community of rocket scientists? On and on it goes. Your context matters, and you must be aware and pay attention to that. I'm using language now as I move through this adaptive leadership material. If we could advance the slides here. To get on the balcony, that is, to get some distance and look at the bigger picture. Not to react quickly to something that happens, but ask the why of this and what's behind all of that. Not to be reactive, to be non-anxious, to live in that, to be able to live in a space where we don't have the answers, that it's okay because we're pursuing God here. We're going to pay attention. We're going to listen and try to sort out the why of this and pay attention to what God is doing in our place. We're going to work hard as leaders in our communities to maintain the right kind of temperature in our congregation. Now, let me explain what I mean here briefly. I'm following Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky here in a series of books around adaptive leadership. For change to occur, first there has to be some sense of anxiety or tension that allows for that change to begin to occur. And we need a little of that in order to help move us forward. When something... So we need to allow for that to happen. It happened for us yesterday as we saw all those stats, right? It's like, now what I've assumed is sort of there. What am I going to do with this? That raises the temperature a little bit for us to begin thinking creatively. But if we get so much anxiety in the system and become so worried and the temperature gets so hot, then we begin to freeze up. I'm mixing my metaphors here. And we become paralyzed and unable to act. One of our tasks as people who are charged with leading communities of faith is to maintain the right amount of tension or anxiety that allows for people to say, that bring people together to work and to pray and to engage, but not so much that it freezes them up and causes them unable to ask the hard questions. So part of our task is to maintain the right kind of temperatures. And then we want to experiment. We're going to have to experiment. There's no way to come up with a 5-year plan. That's very seldom the case now. More likely, the thing is, what can we try here and experiment in just a little way and see if it matters, it makes a difference. And if it does, then we'll do a little more of that. If it doesn't, we're going to try something else. Strategic 5-year plans in congregational contexts today in most churches is not a very good way to go about things. It would be much better to just try some things and see what emerges out of those experiments. So I offer those things. Oh, then one more thing I want to say is about structure. It's very easy for us in large churches or established churches to worry about structures. And a lot of the structures that are in place in your church may be getting in the way of you being adaptive and nimble. You've got this deaconate, this bunch of deacons that are not doing anything in your church, for example. Or we don't know what to do about deacons in our church. Or we've got this ministry here that's been there forever, and it sort of is just there. And how do we do with all these? What do we do with structures? And that's a difficult question. There's more to be said about that, what I can say in this moment. But what I want to say, the principle is to let structure follow ministry, not try to use existing structures and then adapt those structures to let new ministries flow out of that. I would cite Acts chapter 6 to say that the church formed or appointed its first deacon-like people out of a direct action of ministry, not the other way around. It wasn't they had a bunch of deacons waiting to do something and then we assigned them a problem to take care of. The problem emerged, a ministry emerged, and then we found a way to handle that. And that forms the structure. There's a reverse move that we need to make. Let the ministry emerge, let the action emerge, and then we'll worry about the structures that support it. Becomes an important feature of how we move forward. For some reason now my computer is freezing up. Okay, Flourishing Churches in 10 years. That would be a good thing to talk about. Why can I not find that? Here it is. I'm going to say this and then I'm going to wrap us up. No, I don't know if is this in your sheet? No, I've got to say it then. I'm sorry. In 10 years, we're going to see a lot of churches that look kind of like this, that a lot of intentional evangelism is occurring, but it will emerge out of relationality, not out of program. There may be a program, but it's relationality that does the work. These will be churches that have a good reputation in their communities. Somebody might say, what kind of reputation do churches have in their communities today? I think the answer might best be said they don't have a reputation at all. They're just kind of invisible. But flourishing churches in the future will have a reputation in their communities that's characterized by compassion and service. Attendance will not drive engagement. Engagement will drive attendance. I'll just leave it at that. We'll see churches have multi-sites, multi-venues, and multi-days. By that, I mean we're going to see churches have multiple places of engagement, either through small groups or various venues, or places of meeting. They'll have multi-venues. They may have a coffee shop. They may have some other things going on in a community. Or they'll be using their buildings every day of the week, doing various or engaging in various kinds of things. We're going to see more worship gathering, or smaller worship gatherings, and more of them. I'm talking about even large churches will have more services. How many people leave your church many times or only show up at church once a month because they're gone every weekend? We're going to see more and more churches say, we're going to find times to worship on Tuesday night. Or on Sunday night, we're going to bring back Sunday night service. Except it'll be at 8 or 9 o'clock as people are coming back in from their weekend out of town. That's the kind of thing that churches are going to begin to imagine. We're going to see well-connected networked churches. We're going to see small groups be the critical center of church life along with corporate prayer. So with that in mind, let me just ask you for just a couple of minutes to take a look at those table conversations about a path forward. You'll find in your handouts there the path forward material there. What will that look like for you in your place? We'll do 2 minutes and then we're going to take a break.